Is Russia about to enter a civil war? Hello, my friends, Takuya here. Welcome back to the History of Everything podcast. In the past several days, it is possible that you may have seen articles that are titled things such as Chechen warlord declares blood feud on Russian MPs for supposed assassination plot. Articles such as that and YouTube videos saying that a civil war is brewing within Russia have been floating around, well, pretty much all over the internet. And this, my friends, is technically speaking correct, but perhaps not to the degree that people on the internet are calling it to be. Now, I'm not going to call out any specific people or name any names or specific YouTube channels, but needless to say, there have been several of them, and some of them are huge. Channels that unfortunately I respected for quite a large amount of time. Call it propaganda, call it misinformation, call it wishful thinking, call it whatever it is that you will. There is a kernel of truth in that a conflict is possible to break out in Russia. Just not the one that people realize or wish would happen, so to speak. Still, the issue is fascinating, and it reveals just how completely broken the Russian political and economic system is, especially with it being 2 years into its war on Ukraine or its special military operation. Case in point, I'm saying this right now, if you've been doing something for over 2 years, it's probably no longer really special. Oh god, okay, side note on this. My wife is actually really mad as she's glaring at me from the other side of the room for stating it like that. Gabby, no, please. That's not what I mean. Anyway, as you possibly have seen already, the head of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, has publicly accused 3 Russian lawmakers, that being Dagestani Federation Council Senator Suleiman Karimov, as well as State Duma MPs Bekin Barakov and Rizvan Kurbanov, of just like out of a spy movie, plotting to assassinate him and threaten to then declare a blood feud against them. When I say spy movie, I'm talking about the assassination part, not the blood feud. The blood feud sounds like something straight out of the medieval ages because it, well, kind of is. At a meeting with Chechnya's commanders and security forces leaders on the 9th of October 2024, Kadyrov, speaking in Chechen, would reportedly claim to have information about a contract on his life, like something where he was supposed to be assassinated. And when he did this, he warned that the 3 Russian lawmakers that I just mentioned here, if they did not prove that they were not involved, that he would officially declare a blood feud against Barakov, Suleiman Karimov, and Rizvan Kurbanov. Yes, my friends, this is absolutely wild, but in addition to talking about this assassination plot, he also spoke about, for the first time publicly, about the Wildberry incident, which for those of you who have not seen this, well, it's again, kind of an insane story. It's the first time that the Chechen warlord, who is a very close ally of Russian President Vladimir Putin, went and commented about the shooting at Wildberry. This being an event that took place this year in 2024, which was essentially a armed hostile takeover of what is essentially Russia's version of Amazon. If that sounds insane, yes it is, and this is an event in which 2 ethnic English security guards ended up being killed in the takeover of a company. The whole thing is indicative of the chaos and backstabbing within the Russian political system as well as economic system that has been around not just in recent times, but going back all the way into the 90s. The crime that we are talking about here took place around 2 months after a merger between Wildberries and another private firm, Rus, something that is allegedly owned by Dagestani senator and billionaire Karimov, one of the guys that I just previously mentioned. This whole thing was part of a deal that, according to Russian media, was specifically backed by the Russian president, Vladimir Putin. Not the hostile takeover part, the merger part, and how people are trying to stop it. It's, again, extremely, incredibly messy. And even me saying that right now, which I know I've said here multiple times already, that is a understatement, which we will have to explain more here in a bit. But, either way, this whole blood feud thing. In order to explain this and the possible conflict that could be breaking out within Russia between its varying different states, I'm going to need to explain a little bit of context specifically about the region of Chechnya itself and how this kind of functions within Russian society. For context, when we talk about Chechnya, Chechnya is a republic where civil and religious laws are mixed, both with each other and also with ancient customs. Despite heavy Russian influence over the centuries through governmental authority, people in Chechnya oftentimes continued to apply Adat, which is Chechen customary law or Islamic Sharia law, in order to try and resolve civil matters. They don't really want to utilize Russian efforts as they try to see themselves as being more independent. In case you didn't realize when I mentioned that whole thing about the blood feud, that is part of it. These customs have kind of burst back into the headlines all over the world after the Chechen leader, Ramzan Kadyrov, went and declared a blood feud against 3 federal lawmakers from neighboring republics. We're not talking about a case here in which he has sworn vengeance against the central government. No, we are talking about a regional dispute. To explain this, blood feuds have been a fundamental part of Chechen society since ancient times. This is a very old concept, and it persists to this modern day thanks to the fact that, well, people in general in the region don't really trust in Russia's justice system. Gee, I wonder why. Along with this, religion has a very strong role within society, which heavily influences people and culture and makes them more partial to preferring a religious settlement versus a legal settlement through the Russian system. Traditionally, when talking about these blood feuds, they only involve men of legal age, as women are neither the subjects nor the targets of this particular custom. As for why a blood feud would be launched in the first place, there are a multitude of reasons, but arguably the most common ones among these are murder or, violence of the adult variety, we will say. Of course, I'm limited to what I can say here on YouTube. From here, you can probably then see where a proposed assassination would probably come into play then. What is interesting to note about this, though, the key distinction between blood feuds in Adat and blood feuds in Sharia law, which they both exist in it, is that under Adat, within the Chechen system, all male members of the offender's family are able to be considered targets, whereas only the actual perpetrator of a murder or particular issue can be killed under Sharia law, meaning that Chechen Adat is arguably significantly more dangerous and has the potential for a wider conflict. You could probably see why that would now be a problem then when we have a leader of a republic, a government entity within Russia, openly calling for said feud with members of the Russian government. How exactly is any of that supposed to work, and what is the potential outcome of it? Well, my friends, before it is that anyone goes and says that Chechnya is once again going to start a revolt within Russia for the third Chechen war, no, that is not what we are saying here, despite anything that you possibly see on the internet with clickbaity articles and YouTube videos. No, we are talking about a potential conflict between smaller republic subdivisions within the Russian Federation. We're going to need to clarify this further, as you're probably wondering what it is that I mean. Well, for context, we need to address a few things first. One, the very messy story of Chechnya and its relation with Russia and Putin. Two, the wildberry hostile takeover. And three, Chechnya's disputes with its neighbors that actually has the potential to cause a conflict. Yes, my friends, welcome to the History of Everything podcast. We actually go and explain context here on this channel so that people have a complete picture and understanding of what is actually going on. If I sound bitter, I am sorry. I have been very annoyed with things that I've been seeing on the internet here of late. I'm not doing any callouts, I'm not angry, but I am most certainly quite annoyed and gravely disappointed. Either way, to begin, when we talk about Chechnya, officially the Chechen Republic, this is a republic of Russia, something that I have to go and explain here in a second because people don't really understand how Russia is made in the first place. It is a territory that is situated in the North Caucasus of Eastern Europe between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. The republic forms a part of the North Caucasian Federal District and shares land border with Georgia to its south, which is the only actually independent country, and then besides that, you have the Russian republics and territories of Dagestan, Ingushetia, and North Ossetia-Alania to its east, north, and west, along with Stavropol Krai to its northwest. As I said, besides the separate nation of Georgia, which is its entirely own independent country, the rest of the states that I just listed here are part of the Russian Federation with varying different statuses. That is something that many people do not actually realize when they talk about Russia, because yes, Russia is a country, but it is also a federation, composed of many different political entities, cultures, languages, etc., with their own niches that have been carved out within the state. The federal subjects of Russia refers to the constituent units of the Russian Federation according to the Constitution of Russia. Constituents, of which there are many. The Constitution of Russia recognizes 85 federal subjects since March 18th of 2014, although 2 of the most recent subjects are recognized by most states as part of Ukraine. You know, like Crimea, after that whole issue. But either way, regardless of the technical term, the Russian Constitution recognizes federal subjects as being equal subjects under the Russian Federation as a whole. This is something that is comprised of different republics, cities of federal importance, krais, oblasts, etc., etc. Each of its subjects have its own leader, a legislative body, and a constitutional court which is supported by the federal subjects, constitution, and legislation. If you want to compare this to anything, you could almost kind of compare the system with varying greater degrees to the American state system overall, but with vastly different cultures and languages under each. The federal subjects are each represented by 2 delegates each in the Federal Assembly, which you could compare to like the American Senate. But each subject will vary in their degree of autonomy. Some will have more rights and freedoms, and others are more closely controlled by the central government. I spent a bit of time explaining this here, so a number of people are probably asking, what about Chechnya then? How does that come into play? Well, my friends, we are not going to be going into the entire history of Chechnya and the Caucasus, as I'm telling you this right now, that would simply be way too much and an absolute mess to try to address. But, needless to say, this is a region contested by empires for thousands of years. For the purpose of our story here, and so that we don't spend literally hours working on this, we will say that the Caucasus in general were hotly contested between the Ottoman Turks and the Russian Empire for centuries, along with other powers previously before that, but for the purpose of our story, these 2 are the most important. Over the course of the 1800s, the primary goal of the Russian rulers was to go and weaken Turkish and Persian influence, with the mountainous imamate that existed there in the region proving to be a very significant obstacle. Control over the Caucasus, along with Crimea, was intended to secure Russia's position on the Black Sea and provide access to the Mediterranean Sea via the Bosporus. To this very day, with the annexation of Crimea, you can probably see as to why this is incredibly important to Russia. But the problem is, even after Russia went and conquered the South Caucasus, the easily defended mountainous territory of the imamate within the mountainous areas continued to elude conquest. The strong Islamic religious, military, and political traditions of the local population meant that for decades or even centuries that they were going to be a constant thorn in the side of the Russians. But that wasn't necessarily going to last forever. In the 19th century, Chechnya eventually became part of the Russian Empire, which over the decades had to deal with consistent trouble and rebelliousness from the region. Fast forward a bit of time, and after 1917 and the complete collapse of the Russian Empire from World War I, Chechnya was one of the states that failed to establish itself as an independent republic within the Soviet Union, attaining only the status of autonomous republic, which is an administrative subdivision inside of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. However, even with this failure to achieve a nominal degree of independence, the spirit of struggle against the empire would persist over the decades, with Chechen tradition staying alive. Chechnya would maintain its independence aspirations even over the course of Soviet times. Following the German occupation of the Caucasus during World War II, some Chechen and Ingish groups began to collaborate with the Germans in 1943 and 1944, hoping that with their victory, they would be able to gain independence. However, the majority of the Chechen English population still opposed Germany, which, if you've seen anything from what happened during that time, they were trying to wipe out all the varying different minority groups, not just work with them. And so the majority of the population of these regions joined with the Soviets to fight against the Germans. However, it doesn't really matter that the majority of population sided with the Soviets. For Stalin, the fact that some Chechens supported Germany provided a very convenient pretext to a violent resolution to the whole long-standing issue that he had with the North Caucasus. This was a region that had always been kind of rebellious, and now he had a perfect excuse to liquidate it. Consequently, Soviet authorities decided to deport large amounts of the Chechen population en masse and dissolve their republic. The deportation that we're talking about was horribly brutal and involved many different murders over the time. It is estimated from this time period that around a quarter of Chechnya's population would lose their lives here. After the Chechens and Ingish people were taken out of Chechnya, the republic was then settled with people from other parts of the Soviet Union, a common tactic that was utilized by the Soviets in order to try and break ethnic ties to a region. Still though, for the Chechens that remained, that did not mean that they were completely done with the idea of independence. That idea of independence would again resurface during the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because on October 7th, 1991, you would have Dzhokhar Dudayev, who would become president and declare the independence of Chechnya a few days later. For Chechens at the time, this was huge. They had seen over the past several months and years how statehood was pretty much effortlessly gained by Central Asian republics such as Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, and assumed that they would be able to do the same for a Chechen state. However, Russia did not exactly see this as being the case. In 1991, Moscow would immediately challenge the legitimacy of Dudayev's election. The widespread opinion was that Chechnya's secession from the Russian Federation would then set a precedent that would allow for other ethnic groups to try and break away and form their own republics, such as Tatarstan and others. For Russia, this wasn't just a matter of the collapse of the Soviet Union, this would also potentially see the collapse of Russia itself, and that is not something that they wanted to allow. As a result, the First Chechen War would erupt, with the political goal of forcibly trying to retain Chechnya within the Russian Federation. This was a war that was fought by an empire that had been severely weakened over the years. No longer was it the Soviet Union, instead you had the Russian Federation, a shadow of its former self. But, for all intents and purposes, it was not fighting an offensive war as it saw, it was a defensive war, something that they could morally easily justify. In fact, the argument that was being made at the time was that this wasn't even officially a war, it was more of a civil conflict, a putting down of a rebellion, so to speak. The Russian president's associates believed that maintaining lines of communication open between Dudiev and Yeltsin would actually strengthen the former's legitimacy and harm the latter's image. They didn't want Russia to appear even weaker by giving legitimacy to a rebel group within the country. And this was pretty important because Yeltsin was facing significant opposition in Russian politics. Many different groups within Russia were outright blaming him for the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and from that, the fall of Russia as a whole. He could not appear to be weak. And so, afraid to lose the 1996 presidential election, Yeltsin would go and decide to issue secret, unconstitutional war decrees in November and December of 1994 to invade Chechnya. This would then happen, and a brutal conflict would follow. By June of 1995, Russian forces had inflicted at least 30,000 casualties, which included thousands of children. The war that I'm describing here was absolutely brutal, and my friends, if hard feelings existed in Chechnya before towards the Russians, well, it was double so now. But then at the same time, one is probably going to look at this and ask, wait, how does that make sense? The Chechnya of today, whose leader is a very close ally and friend of Putin and Russia, that doesn't really make much sense for the population. Why is that the case? Well, the reason for that goes a little bit like this. During this time of the First Chechen War, the Kadyrov family, which if you recognize that name, that is the name of the current president of Chechnya, it went and established its influence in Chechen politics. You had two characters that are important to this part of the story. You have Ahmad Kadyrov and his son Ramzan, who were among Russia's most formidable adversaries during the First Chechen War of Russia. Like, they fought against the Russians as hard as they possibly could have. And in April of 1995, President Dudiev would go and appoint Ahmed as Chief Mufti of Chechnya. For clarification, for those of you who don't know what this is, the Chief Mufti, also known as the Grand Mufti, is the head of a state's Islamic jurisconsults and regional muftis. The role of the Chief Mufti is to advise the state in courts and to provide opinions on social affairs and Islamic legal matters. It is a high religious authority. Ahmed during this time would play a significant role in helping Chechnya to resist the war from Russia. And from these efforts, the Russian federal authorities would eventually go and sign the 1996 Kosovo Accord with Chechnya, something that was a major success from the Chechen perspective. Or at least it appeared to be a success. While the accords did detail a pullout of all forces from Chechnya by December 31st of 1996, they simultaneously left the issue of relations between Chechnya and Russia open to discussion. The accord stipulated that a formal treaty did not actually have to be ratified until 2001, which left a 5-year gap for pretty much anything to happen. They also failed to address any question of Chechnyan independence, deciding instead to make vague references of relations through bilateral law, none of which actually granted Chechnya any kind of independence. This effectively put Chechnya in a state of limbo, and so after 1996, it became exceptionally unstable. With one of the key factors of that being that the entire region became a hotbed of Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism, which to this very day it has kind of remained so. So how then, one may ask, does that play into Kadyrov? How does that make it so that Chechnya is the way that it is today? Well, my friends, a crucial factor in understanding exactly how Chechnya came to be is the fact that the Kadyrov family, well, completely flipped sides. Ahmad Kadyrov, during the period of the de facto Chechen independence after 1996, found himself in conflict with the increasingly influential Wahhabi groups of the country. For those of you who are unfamiliar, and we definitely need to do a video on this here in the future, there are many different interpretations of Islam, with different schools teaching different aspects, and many of them being more dogmatic than others. The Wahhabist groups tend to be significantly more extreme. Religious conflicts gave rise to political disputes and power struggles, which in turn created further instability within the country. Kadyrov would wage an effective campaign against the Wahhabis, however, not everyone in the country was happy that he was doing this. The president at the time, Ramzan Kadyrov, had been trying to build a broader consensus among different social groups, which, over this time period, allowed Wahhabi influence to expand. Kadyrov, though, had a different approach as to how to take care of the Wahhabi question, something that would only be taken care of after the outbreak of the Second Chechen War, which we're going to need to explain here. On August 8, 1999, Vladimir Putin became Prime Minister of the Russian Federation. The following month after this, several residential buildings in Russia were attacked by Islamic entities, with 2 of these incidents happening in Moscow. Russian authorities at the time would blame Chechen terrorists, which had been behind a number of other attacks. As Putin was preparing to assume power in Russia, this presented an opportunity to him. He could use this Chechen terrorism within Russia proper as a pretext to invade Chechnya itself and cement Russian authority and his own legacy as a unifier and powerful man within Russia. Thus it was then that the Second Chechen War would begin with Russian air raids on Chechnya itself, and on October 1st, a ground offensive would be launched. And that is where the Kadyrovs come in. At the beginning of the Second Chechen War, what Kadyrov would do is he liberated the northern part of the republic from Wahhabi rule, and from this, he made it then possible for the Russians to take over, and afterwards even urged his fellow Chechens to not fight against the Russians. Unlike what Yeltsin had done back in 1994, the Russian leader Putin would go and combine military and political action. Instead of isolating Chechen leadership, he went and formed an informal alliance with Akhmat Kadyrov and his clan, in which the terms of this alliance were pretty straightforward. In exchange for the Kadyrovs pledging their loyalty to Russia, and by virtue of that Putin himself, and ensuring stability in the region, Russia would guarantee the Kadyrov status and power in the region. Russia, from this point on, would basically bankroll Chechnya. They would finance the Chechen budget, and from that, maybe finally get a degree of peace. Throughout the early 2000s, the Russian forces managed to occupy most of Chechnya, with after this independence fighters being reduced to guerrilla tactics to try and resist. Still though, it was not enough, and in March of 2003, a constitutional referendum would be held in Chechnya, and the new constitution that was formed then would guarantee that the territory was going to remain part of the Russian Federation. There was going to be no independence, and the draft of this new constitution was presented by Akhmat Kadyrov. Despite having fought against the Russians in earlier years, he was now their closest ally, and it was he who would become president of the Chechen Republic as part of the Russian Federation. However, all that being said, he didn't actually end up getting to rule Chechnya for very long. His rule was very short-lived. He ended up being assassinated on May 9th, 2004, during the Victory Day celebrations, which is where Russia celebrates their victory in World War II over Nazi Germany. He was assassinated in a meticulously planned attack at a stadium in Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, and after this event happened, instead of an election taking place, President Putin simply agreed to pass on the presidency to Ramzan Kadyrov, his son. As a result, ever since 2007, Ramzan Kadyrov has been the leader of Chechnya. To explain that, President Kadyrov has so far over the years managed to maintain large degrees of stability in the republic that had been not seen in previous decades. However, at the same time, in order to be able to maintain said stability, rather than a president, he has been ruling the entire region more like a king or dictator. One that, honestly, when I talk about this, I could very easily do a dedicated video specifically to just that. So if that is something that you all want to see here in the future, make sure to go ahead and like this video and let me know in the comments section. My editor at this point should honestly be putting up pictures from Chechnya that shows the military and state propaganda that is being put up by this guy. I swear, seriously, look at some of this stuff. It looks like a parody of the American parody movie, Team America, back from the early 2000s, which if you have not seen it, you really go and should. You will know exactly what I'm talking about. Anyway, it's at this point then that we've established the relation between the Kadyrov clan and Putin and Russia itself. For Moscow, the results of all of this are pretty interesting, both good and bad. On one hand, Russia has managed to secure stability in the North Caucasus, a region that has always proved to be very troublesome for them. On the other hand, Ramzan Kadyrov's rule has been brutal, to say the least. It has led to a kind of autarky within the republic. Chechnya has its own distinct legal order and governance system. It is something that is separate from Russia, yet still simultaneously part of Russia. You could almost argue that it is a kind of island within the country itself, connected to the federal state by, well, the lines of money that are being printed and sent to them. Honestly, when we describe Chechnya, it's more like a fief being controlled by a feudal lord, with Ramzan as its duke or king, one who has pledged his loyalty and fealty to Putin, the Tsar of Russia. And as part of this feudal contract, this means that Kadyrov is able to be called up for military service at effectively any time, and this is something that has proved to be invaluable to President Putin's warfare outside of Russia itself. For instance, Kadyrov's East Battalion played a crucial role in the 2008 war with Georgia, as well as in Crimea in 2014. Fast forward to the modern conflict that is still going on to this day with the war in Ukraine, and with Donbass and the invasion into Ukraine, Chechen battalions have been instrumental in maintaining order in regions that have been conquered by the Russians. Over the years, Kadyrov has shown unwavering loyalty to Putin, ready to fight anywhere and any time if the Kremlin requires it. And when I describe that, my friends, that is something that Putin desperately needs when it comes to Ukraine. He needs a loyal man who will do what he says. Because while Russia has made progress, simultaneously, the conflict has not been easy. I have not talked much about the Russo-Ukrainian war on this channel in detail. I've of course mentioned it when talking about global economics and impacts and everything else, but simultaneously I've not gone into nearly as many details because the entire thing is very messy and questionable. But when I say that the war has not exactly gone well for Russia, even with their progress, I mean that. Per the Pentagon, and take that information with a grain of salt or what you will, Russia has sustained more than 600,000 casualties over the course of the war in Ukraine. A severe sign that losses in the conflict are accelerating out of proportion with its gains. Now, when I say that, I am not saying dead, I am saying casualties, which includes wounded and others. Still though, despite that caveat, 600,000 is a pretty severe number, but it is not enough to stop Russia. Despite predictions by Western media and politicians, Russia has still been able to sustain an all-out fight for 2.5 years on. It was initially expected that Russia would not be able to do more than a year, and now that has been disproven. That has been true despite scores of military equipment lost or damaged, chunks of government budget redirected towards defense, and on top of that, a smaller mobilization of troops. My friends, that last part there that I mentioned, that last category is extremely important, given how politically unpopular it would be for Russia if they went and forced a larger draft. So far in the conflict, yes, people are being forced into the military, but simultaneously, it has not gone as far as total mobilization. Russia, for the most part, has been able to recruit more soldiers through a variety of different efforts, higher pension and pay, etc., but also through a greater use of irregular forces, mercenaries, private militias, forces that we see come from people like the Chechens. Yes, my friends, when describing this, Kadyrov's forces that he maintains within Chechnya amount to a kind of personal private army, something that he utilizes in order to maintain power and authority. Technically speaking, the forces that I'm talking about here fall within the chain of command of the Rosgvardia, which is Russia's National Guard. But, that being said, they are not subject to the same kind of conditions and rules and everything else that their federal counterparts have to deal with. Instead, they are commanded entirely by Kadyrov. He is the person who organizes everything. He is the one who is authorized to send them to fight Putin's wars in Syria and Ukraine. As for the exact numbers of what I'm talking about here, that remains to be seen. It is unclear. Different estimates have been given in different times, in which it has put the numbers at anywhere between 6,000 troops and 20,000 troops. We don't really know. But for being a private force for a local ruler, any number of these troops is very significant. And they're not the only ones. In July of 2022, Kadyrov would go and form a new regiment called the 78th Motorized Rifle Regiment, and named after Akhmat Kadyrov, which consisted of 4 conventionally armed battalions named according to the points of the compass. By September, this regiment was reported to be fully staffed and assigned to Russia's 42nd Motorized Rifle Division. As for what kind of role the Chechens would serve in the conflict in Ukraine, yes, they have seen combat, but simultaneously they have done a variety of other things. The initial role of the Chechens over the course of the war was to provide filtration, which is an element of forced deportation of Ukrainian citizens and rear echelon security against bypassed Ukrainian forces and partisans. Essentially, they were the military police. They were the forces who would be in the territory after Russia had conquered it, who would in turn maintain authority in it and remove any problematic elements. These would be the forces that were focused on the Kiev line and were expected to perform collective punishment as part of the offensive operation. Typically, that meant threatening or harming the families of key Ukrainian personnel in order to prevent them from resisting. A technique that Kadyrov had used extensively over the course of the years in Chechnya in order to be able to subdue his opponents and Islamic terrorists. In taking the families of your opponents hostage, there is not really anything that people can do to resist you. At the same time that I described this, Chechen units were also identified as being perpetrators of some of the crimes that you would see take place in Ukraine, such as in Bucha, where they were reported to have terrorized Ukrainian civilians from the moment that they entered the town. The crazy part is, though, it's not just the Ukrainians that the Chechens seem to be fighting against. One of the roles that has been argued for the Chechens' position within the Russian military is as a kind of commissar unit. There have been multiple reports of them executing wounded Russian soldiers in order to prevent them to be captured, and from that, shooting those that retreat from battle in order to be able to force those who are fighting to stay and fight. The utilization of the Chechens in this way is something that is convenient for the Kremlin. It is something that is beneficial for Putin and makes it easier in order to be able to maintain authority and control, and simultaneously not have to pull additional resources from the Russian population that do not actually wish to fight. But at the same time that it makes things easier in one way, it also creates another series of problems. Ramzan Kadyrov has his own political ambitions. He is not just a distinct Putin loyalist. He has his own ideas on how it is that he wants to run Chechnya and what he wants to do with his own personal soldiers. Since the outbreak of the conflict of the Russo-Ukrainian War and the greater utilization of Chechen forces, the Kremlin has been more distant towards the Chechen leader. Kadyrov himself has actually stood up against Moscow multiple times, with one of the key points being the opposition of conscription of large numbers of Chechens during the autumn-winter mobilization of 2022. This being a period in which the rules and restrictions regarding Chechens joining the military were largely dropped because Russia needed to get as many soldiers as it possibly could. Kadyrov would argue that the small Chechen contribution to the war effort was already very substantial, and that they did not need to recruit more men. He wanted to be able to control the men within his own territory as he saw it. In theory, by taking these men and not having Kadyrov control them, it reduces the leverage that he has with Moscow, which is something that is bad for him and weakens him. But simultaneously, over the course of the war, the Putin regime itself has also become gradually weaker after a large series of failures and the conflict now at this point being dragged out by 2.5 years. And so it is from that weakness, my friends, that perhaps, just perhaps, that Kadyrov has been able to back even more insane plays within Russia itself, such as the attempted takeover of Wildberries that we mentioned at the beginning of this video, Russia's version of Amazon. Yes, my friends, that is going to sound absolutely insane, perhaps even more so than anything that we have previously said, but hear me out on this part of the story because it is relevant and there is really no telling where it is that this is going to go in the future. First off, what is Wildberries? Well, as I said before, it's basically the Amazon of Russia. It is a homegrown e-commerce platform where Russians can go and buy just about anything. If you're looking for clothing, cosmetics, any random toy or item, some kind of thing from the modern world, you can get it. And not only can you get it, but you can have it delivered to your own home, just in the same kind of way that Amazon does. This is a company which was founded 20 years ago by Tatyana Balachuk in her apartment as she raised her children. Over the course of the years, the company experienced enormous growth, particularly in the past decade, as more and more Russians, as things modernized, gave up visiting malls and just going and shopping online. This is the natural growth part, at least, that we could talk about. But like many online retailers in the past several years, the company's success was only further turbocharged by the COVID-19 lockdowns, and then later by Western sanctions. This squeezed a lot of Western products out of the Russian marketplace and allowed for online retailers like Wildberries to corner the market on the sale of most goods. And that, in turn, would make Tatyana, who owned 99% of the company, the richest woman in Russia, worth some $8 billion US. You may wonder, okay, wait, 99%, what about the other 1%? Well, that was owned by her husband, which now is her ex-husband, I guess, Vladislav Balachuk. That's going to require some context. In something that plays out like a drama scene on television, in June of 2024, the company would go and announce that it was undertaking a merger with an outdoor advertising firm called Rus. It is here then that things began to get very ugly very fast. Vladislav, the husband, went public with his opposition to the deal, something that reportedly was supported by the Kremlin and Putin himself, who approved it. After this would happen, Tatiana would go and say that she was filing for divorce, which is quite a drastic move, but wait, it gets worse. See, my friends, the merger deal that we're talking about here was odd. It is something that for anyone, any kind of outside observer, any industry analyst, anyone looking in on this would think, hey, this doesn't really make much sense as to why it's being divvied up like this. Wildberries appeared to be getting screwed. You see, Wildberries' profit just this last year in 2023 was 4 times that of Rus, while its revenue was almost 20 times larger. It was a significantly bigger company. But auditors who were looking at the companies would go and estimate that Wildberries' overall valuation, despite this, was only double that of Rus. Not 4 times, not 20 times, not anything in between, just double. Which seems kind of odd, but then you go and look and see that Rus is reportedly controlled by ethnic Armenian brothers Robert and Levin Murzian, who are oligarchs and very close to the Russian government. Now you can probably see where this is going. Despite these very lopsided numbers, under the proposed deal, Wildberries would end up with only 65% of the merged company, while Rus shareholders would receive the remaining 35% of the shares. That is something that seems to overwhelmingly favor Rus, who is getting a far larger share of the pie than their input would suggest that they actually deserve. And Tatiana, the owner of 99% of Wildberries, is set to lose wealth in this deal rather than gain. So why would she do it? Her husband, Vladislav Balachuk, would come out angrily and publicly against the merger, although his small holdings in the company of only 1% meant that he never had any actual authority or power to be able to stop it. So okay, you're probably then wondering, why exactly are we talking about this? This just sounds like a spat between 2 companies and possibly the political system of Russia, where there is very obviously corruption. It doesn't seem like it would be related to all of this. Well, my friends, that is where our friend, Chechen strongman, Kadyrov comes in. See, Vladislav Balachuk went and turned to Kadyrov, a longtime friend, apparently, for help in thwarting the merger. A month after the deal was announced, Kadyrov would go and publicly call it a brazen raid by the Mirzoyan brothers, as well as well-known people from the Caucasus. For clarification, when I talk about this, a raid in Russian business jargon is not actually talking about something like just a takeover or a buyout or anything like that. This is something that refers to a hostile and sometimes very violent takeover of a company. If anything, if you wanted to compare this, think about what would happen during the bootlegging times in America, in which you would have companies, which weren't companies in here, you basically had mafia groups that would fight each other for territory and control. Yes, over the course of the 90s in Russia, that is actually something that would happen. Companies were literally physically fighting each other over territory and control and products. Either way, shortly after this happened, Tatiana Balachuk would go and file for divorce from Vladislav. And the result of that was, as I just previously explained, it appears to be a true raid in the Russian sense. Things were going to get violent. On September 18th, 2014, Vladislav Balachuk would show up at the Wildberries offices in Moscow, along with a group of 20 men, including several Chechens. He claimed that he wanted to attend a meeting about the upcoming merger. However, Tatiana Balachuk would deny that there was any kind of meeting, that wasn't something that was actually taking place. According to videos of the encounter that pretty much anyone can go and watch on Telegram, the men would push and scuffle with security guards, and then afterwards, with police. At one point, a man would even use a club to try and break a window in order to gain entrance to the building. After this, even more fighting would take place. In the aftermath of the fight, an investigative committee would say that 2 people were killed after shots were fired, and that 2 police officers were wounded. More than 24 people would be detained over this incident. After this, in a tearful video that she would post on Telegram, again, something that looks like it's straight out of a mafia drama movie, Tatiana Balachuk would say that, quote, armed men raided our offices, started a shootout, mayhem, young men died. Vladislav, this being referring to her husband, what are you doing? How are you going to look into the eyes of your parents and our children? A day later, after this, Vladislav would be charged in connection with the incident. 6 other men would also be charged and ordered held pending trial. The entire incident was crazy, and it grabbed the attention of pretty much everyone in the country, not just because of how big of a company Wildberries is, but also specifically because, as I previously mentioned, this was almost a carbon copy of what had been happening back in the 1990s. This being when gang shootings, car bombing, street fights, and raids by companies were commonplace in Moscow. This is serious for Putin, because one of the key points of his popularity, one of the key reasons as to why he has been able to maintain political authority, along with, all the other questionable things that have been done, is that specifically he has cultivated an image over time as being the guy who ended the lawlessness of the 90s, the person who brought Russia into the modern era and saved it. And now, perhaps thanks to the actions of one of his political allies, Kadyrov, that image has been besmirched. This is something that could easily fuel a great divide between what were longtime political allies into potential political rivals and enemies. But, my friends, that in turn brings us back to the opening statements at the beginning of this video. For weeks after the event, Kadyrov said nothing publicly about Wildberries. But at a meeting with Chechnya's commanders and security forces on the 9th of October, Kadyrov, while speaking in Chechen, would reportedly claim to have information about a contract on his life. And as I said, he warned that if the 3 Russian lawmakers did not prove that they were not involved, he was going to declare an official blood feud against them. These being Barkayev, Karamov, and Kurbanov. Karamov and Kurbanov are originally from Dagestan, one of the territories that borders Chechnya, in which there have been a long series of disputes, while Barkayev is an Ingushetian native, again, one of the territories that borders Chechnya. Kadyrov has accused the trio of plotting his murder, and simultaneously of trying to wrest control of Russia's biggest online retailer, Wildberries, from Vladislav Balachuk's estranged spouse. What's crazy is that the Chechen leader has pledged to aid Balachuk not only in helping to stop this merger, but in helping to reclaim his wife. Anton Gerashenko, who was once an advisor in Ukraine's interior ministry, would remark that the dispute between Karamov and Kadyrov is the most, quote, serious in a decade. Saying in a post on his ex-social media channel, quote, there is a serious discussion in Russia that could lead to a war between Chechens and Dagestanis. A note from the Dagestani Interior Ministry would say that the blood conflict that the Chechen leader outlined and accusations of organizing this assassination are seriously destabilizing the situation in the Northern Caucasus. Furthermore, he would state, according to political analysts close to the Kremlin, apparently Moscow is no longer able to extinguish or control this conflict. There are rumors that the National Guard of Russia and Interior Ministry forces will be redeployed to the North Caucasus, and it may also be possible that army groups will be strengthened. End quote. So, my friends, when I go and describe all this, what I have listed here are rumors and hearsay and conjecture, possibilities, theory, guesses. There is no proof of anything happening, nor a complete breakdown of the Russian political system, as some channels or articles would have you believe. But while there is no civil war breaking out in Russia yet, there is a possibility of a regional conflict within the Caucasus. Remember when I said before that there are tensions between Chechnya and Dagestan? These are tensions that have existed for years, for decades, over land and border disputes. Something that is threatening to explode into an actual conflict if things take a turn for the worse. This comes as a result of a deadline that Chechnya had imposed on itself in 2019 in order to restore a Chechen district by the end of 2024, something that Stalin had disbanded back in 1944. The situation has been further exacerbated by increased competition for housing and land in area between Chechens who have returned and have the support of the Chechen Republic and the 2 other nationalities in the region, the Avars and the Laks, who have moved in after the Chechens were deported. These groups are minorities in that particular region, but their ethnicity is far larger and more politically influential in Dagestan as a whole. Perhaps most importantly, when we describe this, the situation continues to deteriorate over time as the Kremlin, the central government within Russia, Putin, has stayed away from the whole issue. They don't exactly know what to do about it, if anything to do at all. So they've tried to stay away. For context, Moscow went and restored the Chechen-Ingush Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic in 1957. This allowed the Chechens and Ingush to return to their homelands in the North Caucasus. The 16,000 ethnic Chechens who went and returned to Dagestan expected that the Ok district there was going to be reestablished and that their homes and pasture land and everything that they previously had were going to be returned to them. But no, none of that happened. The area was occupied by the Avars and the Laks, who had been brought in by the previous government in order to be able to settle the region and control things. The area was divided between a Novolak district, populated by the Laks, and the Kazbek district, which the Avars would go and dominate. The Chechens would, of course, protest this during Soviet times, but really there was nothing that they could do. They were so politically and ethnically weak that nothing could happen. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Chechens of Dagestan, supported by Chechens in Chechnya and relying on a new law guaranteeing the restoration of rights of deported peoples, they began to become more active and fight for recognition of this territory. In 2019, Dagestan would actually commit to meeting their demands by 2025. But since then, however, it hasn't actually done anything, fearing that anything that they do could potentially spark an ethnic conflict between its varying different peoples that would undermine their own power and open the way for Chechnya's leader, Kadyrov, to go and annex a part of the region as a whole. So remember what I said, 2025 is the deadline. And as that approaches near, considering that it is now close to the end of 2024 that I'm making this video, Chechens living in Dagestan have stepped up demands that regional officials live up to their promises. Dagestan, however, fearful of Avar and Lak opposition and Chechen Republic aggression, has not only dragged its feet on following through with its promises, but has done the exact opposite. They have continued to build housing in the disputed area and handed it out primarily to Avars and Laks rather than Chechens, which has largely helped to radicalize them in the region. The Caucasus in this territory are a hotbed of fundamentalist Islamic terror, and that is something that is only becoming more common as time goes on. Dagestani officials are frightened by this development and have been conducting meetings in order to explore how it is that they might reassure the Chechens without enraging the local Lak population. Pissing off the Avars as well would be practically political suicide, as they form almost a third of the Republic's population and have long dominated political life within the state. But these meetings have really not done anything in the end. Instead, officials have failed to address any of the demands, which in turn has radicalized both sides. That trend is practically guaranteeing that a boiling point is eventually going to be reached on this issue. The prospects, then, that I'm talking about here make the situation with the Chechens in Dagestan very much Moscow's problem. To this very day, the Kremlin has tried to downplay its responsibility in the region. This being because if it does end up actually being responsible, as it already is, then that means that it may be forced to divert forces from Ukraine to the region to serve as a kind of police or peacekeeping force. Something that would further weaken its position. If things take a turn for the worse, simultaneously, this means that Moscow and Putin would also potentially be forced to take responsibility for the issue, something that could damage him politically. Which, unfortunately then, for Putin, combined with increasing religious extremism, could then lead to a wider and much more violent conflict that could potentially rip parts of Russia apart and further weaken his political authority. Kadyrov has been a loyal dog on a chain for decades, but he is a dog who is also prepared to bite the hand that feeds. So in the end, my friends, does this mean that a civil war is breaking out in Russia and it's the end of Putin, as a number of articles and videos have said? No. No, it is absolutely not. But what it is a potential issue for the future. One that, with time, could erode the authority of the central government and lead to greater problems down the road. Really, at this point, only time will tell. But you can rest assured that if anything does happen, I will tell you and explain to you how it is that it took place in the first place. My friends, this has been Stakui with the History of Everything podcast. Thank you all very much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Again, over the course of this video, and I know I'm saying this here at the end, I'm not calling out any specific channels when I do this. It's not something that I particularly like to do. I don't seek drama, but there are many things here on the internet that I have been seeing of late that bother me. And some channels' obsessions with certain topics, such as Russia, China, Israel, etc., really at certain points come across more as clickbait than anything else, and I really don't like that. There's already enough misinformation in this world where people don't understand things, and I would like to think that on this channel we try to avoid such things. Thank you, my friends, for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Check me out on Patreon if you want to support my work, as obviously these kind of videos take a long time to make, and simultaneously, YouTube can be very unfriendly towards them at times, so anything you all do to support me really helps. I appreciate all of you, and I'll see you all here next time. Goodbye, my friends.